My name is Paige, and I had community ecology in the oceans. So, what is community ecology? Community ecology examines interactions between populations of organisms, and it kind of determines how different species influence one another within the community. So, species richness, it's not a surprise based on the amount of Earth that is ocean water, but 80% of life on Earth is in the oceans. And the oceans are the most species diverse biome in the world. There's the most production there, most biomass. So again, that doesn't come as a surprise. And there's countless ecosystems within the ocean, so it allows for a lot of that diversity. Here are just a few examples of different ecosystems within the ocean. Coral reefs, abundant, full of life. Those hydrothermal vents, I'm sure you guys have seen, we've talked about in class, I think. Um, Ocean floor versus open ocean, completely different ecosystems between the two. So not only is there variation across the ocean in different areas, in different countries, in different nutrient zones, there's also variation as you go deeper into the ocean. So with no surprise, most life is going to exist on that in that sunlight zone. Photosynthesis can occur because of the sunlight. You get those primary producers able to, produce a lot of energy, and so you're going to get the most light there, most nutrients, and the most life. But you still are going to see life within those deep sea zones. And the ecology between the two, and especially the community ecology, changes dramatically between the sunlight zone, twilight zone, and deep sea zone. And here's just a few examples of different ecosystems within the ocean. So here's coral reefs, picture of a whale in the open ocean, and here's those hydrothermal vents. Uh, some scientists believe that life started independently at those hydrothermal vents. So they believe that because there was no sunlight able to get there, and life still exists there. So many believe that, based on the biogeochemical physical structure of these hydrothermal vents, they were able to create life independently. So it's pretty cool. And that just kind of shows you how different, community ecology could be because there's so many different ecosystems. You can have a lot of different niches. So interspecies interactions. There's three major types of interactions amongst different species. So there's competition, there's predation or herbivory, and there's symbiosis. So competition. A major theory and principle in ecology is this competitive exclusion principle. So, and it's common sense really. No two species with the exact same niche can coexist in a community. And luckily, there's not a lot of species with the exact same niche because they vary based on physiology, based on evolution in time, temporal and spatial scale. So what time of the year they're there, where how they migrate, etc. And there's two different types of competition. There's interference competition. So a good example is when sharks will scare away other animals trying to eat at large pools of fish. So the sharks are actually literally preventing the other predators from eating, any other fish, therefore outcompeting them. They're interfering with them. And then there's exploitation, which is in the name. It's when an organism will exploit a certain resource by, just eating it before anybody else can get there or using it before anybody else can get there. So a good example is when a large barnacle takes up a lot of space on a rock so other animals can't attach there. So here's an example of a few predators at a big school of fish. As you can imagine, there's a lot of interference competition among large predators and schools of fish. Ocean niches, the major categories don't vary that much from terrestrial niches. predators, herbivores, producers, decomposers, dispersers, scavengers, parasites, pathogens. And there's really infinite more based on, the individual species. There's so many different factors that can play a role, um, whether it's nutrient levels, whether it's pH levels, and what the species is able to tolerate. So they can change based on a lot of different factors. So let's look at herbivory and predation. Primary consumer examples: zooplankton, small fish, crustaceans like lobsters, mussels, shrimps, sea urchins, krills, manatees, anything that will eat the plants or eat phytoplankton, because they're the other major primary producers in the ocean. Here's a manatee eating some seagrass. That's their favorite food. They have to eat a lot a day because they're huge animals and all they eat is seagrass. In the middle is a parrotfish. And if you've ever been, diving or even just snorkeling, maybe off the coast of Florida or anywhere else in South America, you've probably seen parrotfish. They're really common. And parrotfish, they have this big beak on their mouth, and they use that beak to eat phytoplankton and other plants off of rocks. And so you'll see them just cruising around eating that stuff off the rocks. And there's a sea urchin. Predation. Secondary consumer examples: fish like wrasse, butterfly fish, triggerfish, damselfish, silver sides. There's a lot of fish that you can name there. I just named some that I could think of. Some crabs, sea star, humpback whales, nudibranchs, etc. The list could really go on and on. And then tertiary consumer examples: large fish that will eat those secondary consumers, like barracuda, groupers, snappers, octopus, squid, eels, sharks, etc. And then there's apex predators, which are those tertiary consumers that don't have predators. So the apex predators of the oceans are sharks, killer whales, and dolphins. I think also like albatross is an example, and there's a few more. I just put up a food chain, a food pyramid, just to kind of look at the different levels of the food pyramid within the ocean. And so I don't leave them out, I added a slide about decomposers because they're really important. So bacteria, worms, crabs, brittle star, they can, they're all decomposers of that ocean detritus on the ocean floor. Brittle stars, I just use them as an example because they're the only ones that aren't really microbial, and they can also be scavengers. So brittle stars are these really cool sea stars that you'll see. Technically, they're not sea stars; they're brittle stars, but they go around and they can act as scavengers and eat pieces of fish that are on the ocean floor, and they can also act as decomposers. Symbiosis. So symbiosis are relationships that have evolved between certain species, and they can be beneficial for both species, or sometimes just for one species, and then sometimes they'll harm one of the species. They can be individual population level relationships, and there's three major types of symbiotic relationships: commensalism, mutualism, and parasitism. Commensalism. Commensalism is when the relationship helps one species but doesn't really harm or benefit the other. So they most of the time don't notice. An example of that is remora. So if you've ever, probably if you've ever just seen a picture of a shark or blue planet, or if you've ever, gone shark fishing, if you've ever seen a shark, you'll see a remora with it. And they're these fish that will attach themselves to turtles or sharks or rays, and they'll eat the fecal matter from their host animal, and they'll use them as protection. And they'll kind of eat off the algae and bits of matter on the skin. Um, and it saves them energy because they get this constant water flow onto their gills without actually having to swim. So it's really great for them. And then, most barnacles. Barnacles are an arthropod, and they attach themselves to turtles, whales, and other animals, And so they get this free ride to these nutrient-rich waters without actually doing any harm to the turtles and whales that they're attached to. Here's a picture of a ray with looks like 6 or 7 remora attached to it. Again, they're really just getting a free ride. They're just going with the flow. They get the energy that the ray puts out, and they just get to tag along as they attach themselves to it. And they get to eat its fecal matter, and the remora doesn't really mind it. And looks like a green sea turtle with, as you can see, there's 2 barnacles on her carapace scutes. And a lot of times people will think that the barnacles cause the animals harm, um, but they're actually sometimes can just act as indicator species. So a few times I've had turtles wash up on beaches, and whether they're sick or dying, the public gets this idea that the barnacles are what kills the turtles. But it's not the barnacles that kills the turtles. When those turtles that wash up have tons of barnacles on them, it's because they were sick or dying in the first place. So if a turtle's moving really slow, it's more likely that those barnacles can attach to it. So they're actually just an indicator of the species' health. But they get this bad, reputation for killing the species, but actually they're just an indicator species of turtle health. So mutualism. Mutualism is when both species benefit from the relationship. Some examples are cleaner shrimp. Everybody's probably seen the cleaner shrimp, at least in pictures before. So the cleaner shrimp will eat parasites off of organisms. And I'm sure you've probably seen, a picture or Blue Planet or something where the fish is opening up his mouth for the cleaner shrimp to come and clean off the parasites from his mouth. And then another really good example is that coral and zooxanthella, and it's an algae that grows in the cells of the coral, and it does photosynthesis, and it converts the energy from photosynthesis and gives it to the coral. So the coral needs that energy to survive, and the algae gets to, survive its habitat in the coral, and it gets a protection, and it's a good mutual relationship for them. And then everybody knows Nemo, the clownfish, and sea anemone. The clownfish use anemone as protective habitat, and in return, the clownfish provides nutrients in its waste and defense to the anemone. So here's a picture. Here is a cleaner shrimp and what looks like a grouper. I'm not a fish expert, but I think that might be a grouper. And these cleaner shrimp are so cool. They actually have these cleaning stations, and there's abundance of cleaner shrimps in one area, and fish will actually come and swim to the cleaner station to come have their mouths cleaned out by these cleaning shrimp. So it's kind of like a car wash for their mouths is a good example. But it's really cool. If you've ever, uh, you know, scuba dived or yeah, mostly scuba diving, a lot of divers will do this. Well, they'll open their mouths, and this I don't think this is super legal, but they'll open their mouths and the shrimps will come and clean out of the mouths of the divers. But it's a pretty cool experience if you're into it. And here's kind of the anatomy of a coral. So you can see where the zooxanthella will live inside the cells of the coral. And it's just this like obligatory mutualistic relationship that these two have in order to be able to survive. It's very cool. And then there's Marlin coming out of his anemone. And they have these, the anemone will strike anything that comes near it as protection from predators. Um, but the anemone have evolved to not strike the clownfish. And sometimes they do. Sometimes they still do. Accidents happen. And it's difficult to tell the difference between different types of fish. But when they do strike them, the clownfish actually have evolved to have this mucus layer on them that protects them from any harm that the anemone might do. And in return, when predators come near the anemone, the clownfish will kind of lunge out and scare them. And so it, scares things away from them and protects them. Parasitism. So parasitism, it doesn't say on here and it should, but Parasitism is when one species benefits and the other species has harm. So there's ecto versus endoparasites. And ectoparasites will be on the outside. They'll attach themselves to the outsides of the host organism, whereas an endoparasite will live within the organism. There's parasitic isopods. There's a good example, and these are a pretty well-known example. And they'll enter fish through the gills, and they'll attach themselves to the tongue of the fish. Then they'll actually physically detach the tongue of the fish, and they replace it in the fish's mouth. It's pretty gross. And what they do is they'll eat fish mucus, they'll eat what the fish has been eating, and they'll sometimes suck blood from the host organism. So they're pretty ick. And then another example is parasitic barnacles and crabs. These ones are possibly even grosser. But there's this complex reproductive cycle, and what ends up happening is the fertilized eggs of the barnacles will get laid in the male crab's genitalia. And the male crab will care for the eggs, the fertilized eggs of the barnacles. And typically, male crabs don't lay eggs, and they don't care for their eggs. So it's really unusual that they care for the eggs of the parasitic barnacles. And so these barnacles have actually changed the behavior of these male crabs and has them acting like female crabs, essentially. And when that happens, the crab can't molt anymore and it can't reproduce. So it really greatly lowers the fitness of these individual crabs. Oh, here's pictures. I have gone fishing before, and I have caught a fish with an isopod off the coast of Florida. And I think we were fishing to eat, and I had to just throw that one out because I couldn't eat the rest of the fish knowing the isopod was in it because it just grossed me out too much. It's a scary thing when you open a fish's mouth and you see that guy. And then here's a picture of the barnacle egg sac on the male's crab's genitalia. So pathogens are kind of a form of parasites. Pathogens are these small microbial disease-causing agents that include bacteria, viruses, fungi, and parasites. So examples that you've probably all heard of: Brucella, Leptospira, Cryptosporidium, Giardia, certain fungal diseases, Salmonella. So these are pretty common pathogens that you see in the ocean. I think this fish had some kind of fungal disease that was eating away at his scale cells, so poor guy. And there are my references. And just as a leaving note, my favorite thing about the oceans is on my last slide, and that's bioluminescence. Don't we all love that?